Welcome in everyone to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Wednesday, June 26th, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking a little bit about Charlie Baker, the NCAA President. He is going after some government help, possibly to help him out with some of the Title IX implications of the House settlement. We've kind of gotten into this a little bit, but want to break down the full scope and kind of get you guys an idea of what could happen if this is denied and how crazy it could be, really. Then we'll get into kind of a broadcasting battle that is happening between the college football playoff and the end of the NFL season, Week 16 most in particular. I kind of want to break down the implications of that and how we cannot bow down to the NFL in this instance. I want to get into a little bit of a recruiting update for you all. We'll do the Heisman Watch. We've done the SEC and the Big Ten. We'll get into the Big 12 today before we finish it out with some Wednesday what-ifs. And we have a ton of really, really good questions to break down for you all today. So definitely will be a very, very fun show. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show. And the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to kind of have a fun, interactive experience here, and I think that's always good for the both of us. Again, that's gsmcpodcast.net. But let's jump right in, and let's talk about Charlie Baker, the NCAA President, and the battle that he is fighting currently with Title IX and kind of the government involvement in this new House settlement. So, as we all know, the House settlement went over probably about 2 months ago now, and it states that schools can spend up to $22 million to distribute throughout their athletic department through revenue sharing. And that was kind of a big step forward in college sports and definitely changed a lot of things. And there's going to be a ton of questions about how is that distributed, how is that worked out. And the big question here with how it's distributed is, how much does Title IX come into play? Is it something that is hard and fast and you cannot get around it? Is it something that you can kind of toy with a little bit and play around some of the different rules that are in place currently? So it's going to be kind of an interesting battle back and forth. I think one of the big things here is that I've kind of always zeroed in on, at least talking about college football and college sports in general, is there's always going to be inequities. We all understand that. That's just kind of the nature of the sport. You know, the Georgias and the Bamas of the world are always going to have more than the Troys and the Tulanes of the world. But the reality is, there is a world where we can do absolutely everything in our power to make sure that that gap doesn't widen, that there's not any other things that the big dogs can do that the other guys can't, that would hurt, that would kind of change the dynamic even more, I suppose. And I think that's the biggest thing here, where the NCAA kind of has a duty to make sure that there's not this massive disconnect between the one and the other. And obviously there's going to be to a certain extent, but you have to make sure that you keep as much power in the hands of the small guys. You have to make sure that you keep as much equity, I suppose, as you possibly can. And the only way to do that is to make sure that we're all moving forward as one. So this is going to be a really interesting thing to watch as we kind of get into the next era of college football and college sports in general. And I think there's tons of questions around it, obviously, but the reality is, when we talk about this type of thing, when we talk about really the future of college football and college sports in general, we almost have to move as one. Matt Winter, an NIL expert and a sports lawyer over at Ken Hertz Perry, had talked about this, and he said that there are a number of athletic departments that are pushing towards the 50-50 model because they feel like Title IX would apply and you would have to split it between women's and men's athletes evenly. There's also some that are going more towards the football and basketball route. The one that we broke down last week was 75% to football, 15% to men's basketball, with 5% to women's, and then 5% to be split among all the other sports. Obviously, this is not necessarily ideal, and the 50-50 split would be something that I would lean towards, mainly because there are so many other avenues for money in this sport, right? We added NIL, we added collectives, and it doesn't look like they're going anywhere necessarily. that is the way you can keep your competitive advantage if you are the Georgias of the world or the Bamas of the world. But I think if you're not moving as unison, and there is an argument to be made that it should be 80% one direction and 20% to another direction. I can see that argument. But regardless of what the breakdown is of this money, it has to be even across the board. Because then you're creating issues where maybe some teams just decide to be really good at men's basketball, and then some teams decide to be really good at football, and then some really good at baseball. I don't know. But the reality is, you don't want a world where they can kind of just allocate these funds as they see fit and essentially slowly pull more money away from these smaller sports. And it's kind of one of those issues where the NCAA could stand on a stage. Charlie Baker is more than welcome to tell all the schools that they have to split it 50-50 and that's just the way it's going to be. The issue is that doesn't necessarily hold up in a court of law too well. There is definitely going to be people that push back on that, particularly football players, because as we all know, the football is the big moneymaker for any athletic department across the country. And they would make the argument that they're not making what they're bringing in. And they would have a good argument for that, to be totally fair. So it's one of those battles where you'd love to be able to just have everyone get together, get around a campfire, sing Kumbaya, and decide that they're all going to move forward as one. That's probably not going to happen. That's definitely not going to happen. I'll be totally honest. The SEC and the Big Ten have made it very clear that they have every intention of staying ahead of the pack and widening that gap as much as they possibly can. So I don't necessarily have a lot of faith that we're going to be able to move forward without government intervention. And that's obviously something that is kind of I don't want to say a precarious situation. It's very, cut and dry once it does happen, that it's going to be something that doesn't necessarily fix this overnight, but at least gives us a framework moving forward, and it can all happen fairly quickly. But it could take a little bit of time to get that, right? We are in the middle of an election year. It's not necessarily at the top of their list in terms of things to get done right now. So I think it's fair to think that this is going to take some time. And the issue is, this comes into play in the 2025 academic year, so 25-26 academic year, and you have to figure that out before this. There's already legal action against the NCAA from Houston Christian University and FCS schools saying that they weren't represented in these discussions when the House settlement went over. I'd argue that is absolutely the case. There's also some other schools that are thinking about possibly filing motions against the NCAA. So there's going to be so many different things that have to happen with this new world that we live in. But the way to kind of subside all of it, the way to kind of make sure that you have something in writing that not only is ironclad within the NCAA, but is ironclad when you look at U.S. law, is to make sure that the government gets involved here. And is to make sure that there's something in writing that says Title IX fully applies here or Title IX does not apply at all here. And frankly, I'd much rather the former than the latter, because I think if you decide that it is totally free reign, and everyone can kind of allocate this money as they see fit, you face a totally different battle. And you face kind of a weird one where, let's say Texas decides they're going to go with the 75-15, 5-5 breakdown that we talked about earlier on. That's a number that 75 is a great number right now, but I don't think that's necessarily the end all be all. If we decide that, this is kind of, you can split it how you please and Title IX has no implications on this, they're going to be able to split that money how they see fit, and more money is going to start coming in from football, and they're going to realize maybe we should just start pushing money in that direction. And that's kind of the biggest worry for me, where if you leave an open door for some of these teams to make those decisions to kind of, for lack of a better word, kind of bury some different athletic programs in their athletic department, we're going to have an issue. That's just the reality. And also, if they're splitting it differently, then you have a totally other issue. You have, a one group of people who are making the, probably more equitable decision, the one that, puts everyone on the same footing and upholds Title IX and everything in between. And then you have the group that is fully focused on football and basketball and wants to make as much money as possible. And that's all well and good, but the reality is, if, let's say, Tulane wants to split it 50-50, but they only have $1 million to throw around. This is a total hypothetical, but Texas has $22 million to throw around. It doesn't necessarily matter how you cut that money. they're still going to be able to pay more to the smaller sports in their program, to the smaller women's sports. So some of these schools just have more ability to split it 80-20 or to split it 70-30 and still put a lot of money into women's sports. And that's kind of the battle that you're under right now, because you can't mandate that everyone puts in a certain amount of money, because not everyone has that certain amount of money unless people are willing to give it to them, which is not going to happen. You're going to have some people that are under that 22 million. Actually, the vast majority will be under that 22 million. And you kind of have to figure out how you go forward, where there's going to be inequities. There's no two ways about that. Whether you split it 50-50 or you split it 80-20, there's going to be people that are paying football more, that are playing women's basketball more, that have more ability to put this money up. But it doesn't change that everything should, at least on paper, be on even footing. And everyone should at least have to follow the same rules of procedure, I suppose, when you go into this new world. So it's not necessarily about the dollar amount that each school is putting up. Obviously, that is going to be different. It has been different for the past, 3 decades in the sport. It's been different, the amount of money that each school, each athletic department has to throw around. But you have to make sure that they're all throwing around the same percentage of money, because then you get into a precarious situation where maybe, 5 years down the road, the teams that are using the full 22 million come knocking at the door and say, we kind of want to distribute 30 million, or we want to distribute 40 or 50 million, because we can do that. And then the gap widens even more, and then you have more and more problems. So there just needs to be unity moving forward. It doesn't necessarily need to be fully the way that I want it necessarily. The inequities are going to exist forever in this sport and in college sports in general, but the reality is we need to get somewhere where we're moving together as one. If we don't, then there's going to be a lot of college sports that get cut loose, whether that's through, it not bringing in enough money, or that's through some other sports getting angry that they're not getting their fair share and kind of suing and creating a real problem in this kind of space we hold. But the reality is there has to be a unity moving forward. There has to be an understanding that Tulane is going to do the same thing that Missouri is going to do, and Missouri is going to do the same thing that Alabama is going to do, and you can't have different conferences going different directions, because that creates a whole problem. You can't have different schools going in different directions, because that creates a tons of problems. So you need to make sure that there's one standard across the country, and once you figure that out, we can move forward and we can have a pretty equitable, pretty normal and good future of the college sports. But until we move forward as one, it's going to be a mess, and it's going to be a lot of people having a ton of benefits and a lot of people running a lot of the weight of this problem and the weight of these issues. So it's going to be kind of a battle back and forth. We'll see how Title IX comes into this, but regardless of how Title IX comes in, we got to move forward as one, and we have to make sure the schools are operating as one entity, and if they're not, then we have a ton of problems on our hands. So we'll see if government help comes into play. But as of right now, we're going to take our first break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about a little battle between the college football playoff and the NFL. Definitely a battle that I felt like we all saw coming at some point with the late season or NFL regular season slots. But it's definitely getting a little bit more real. So we'll break that down right after this. So stick with us.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about Charlie Baker and his implications with Title IX and trying to get the government's help to figure out how it plays into the new House settlement. Definitely will be a very interesting thing to watch and will shake up college sports for quite some time if it goes one direction or the other. But let's get into the college football playoff versus the NFL. Week 16 of the NFL, as we all know, tends to fall a little bit on Saturday. They've started to kind of get into that realm as college football season ends and bowl games and that type of thing starts. You get into NFL season kind of dipping their toe into the Saturday waters. And for a long time, frankly, I thought it was just a handshake agreement. I thought they were all on the same page there. But it is the Sports Broadcasting Act of 1961 that kind of holds them to this. It dictates that the NCAA has to avoid televising games from Friday at 6 p.m. through midnight Sunday, so the end of Saturday, starting the second Saturday in September through the second Saturday in December. So that's kind of the window of college football season for the most part. So they can't necessarily broadcast a game on Saturday in the middle of October if they wanted to, because that'd be against this act. So it's a very kind of interesting dynamic, but the reality is once that ends, the NFL has no reason to not jump into Saturdays, and it's kind of caused a little bit of a precarious situation with the new with the new college football playoff, and particularly the first round games. We talked about this not too long ago, frankly, when we were talking about all the different implications and the scheduling of the college football playoff, but the reality is there is going to be a little bit of an overlap here. Week 16 of the NFL season is going to fall on the same day as those first round games for the college football playoff. The new first round games that'll be at home for some of the teams. That'll be kind of really, really fun atmospheres that I cannot wait for. They won't necessarily overlap too much in terms of time of the game, but there is a little bit of an overlap, and that causes a little bit of issue with college football and the college football playoff, because I think we all understand what the NFL is when it comes to broadcast, when it comes to just TV deals in general. They are the king. Everyone understands that whenever anything is up against the NFL, it almost doesn't matter what type of NFL game you're playing. The NFL is going to win. The NFL absolutely dwarfed the NBA and the MLB when they had head-to-head dates throughout the last couple of years. So the reality is, the NFL wins most of these battles. That's just the truth, and that's just kind of the way of things. We have to make sure they don't win this one. I'll be totally honest. I understand that it's going to be really tough to cut away from, I believe, Bills Chiefs is one of the games, Chiefs Texans is one of the games that day, but some really, really good games nonetheless on that day. So definitely there will be people tuning into the NFL games. I frankly would probably be tuning into both, but the reality is, this could become a bigger problem down the road. This is not necessarily, only this year. I was trying to think of a better word, but this is not necessarily only going to happen this year. This is going to happen throughout the, future of the college football playoff with 12 teams, right? This is kind of the scheduling that we've, the scheduling that we've come accustomed to and the one that we've decided on, and that's just kind of the way that we're moving forward. The issue is the NFL might just be adding another game to the regular season here pretty soon, going to an 18-game schedule. And if that happens, then you have excuse me, I very much apologize. But if that does happen, you have even more dates that could come into issue with the college football playoff and the NFL. So this is not necessarily just confined to this 1 year. This is going to be something they're going to have to battle for quite some time, and it's going to be really interesting to watch. I mean, the NFL just dominates people. They had 10 times higher ratings than NBA on Christmas Day. They kind of took over Christmas Day last year, which I can't imagine the NBA was too happy about. Then the World Series actually purposely avoided the NFL's highest rated television window on Sunday to make sure that they actually got viewers. So this is the reality of what you're up against, right? Everyone knows the NFL is king. It's going to be really hard to argue otherwise. They dominated TV for quite some time, and they likely will for quite some time to come. 93 of the 100 highest rated television programs in 2023 were NFL games. 3 of them were college football games, with Ohio State, Michigan being the top of the bunch at 61 in the 100. So definitely a little bit of a different game, right? The NFL is going to dominate this conversation, but the reality is there needs to be some type of intervention that fits everyone, right? There needs to be some type of agreement where the NFL and college football come together, and they actually did kind of discuss a little bit when they were kind of making the college football playoff schedule, but the NFL wasn't moving off that Saturday if they didn't have to, right? So that might be something that they kind of look into, at least the college football side of things, is trying to extend that window that they have in the 1961 Sports Broadcasting Act. Maybe extend that through December. Maybe extend it through the national title game, although that's going to be incredibly tough to pull off. But the reality is there needs to be some type of midway, I suppose, between these two entities where we don't necessarily have too much of overlap and we don't have one losing viewership to the other, but that's going to happen this year one way or the other. Someone's going to end up watching the NFL game over the first round college football game and vice versa. And the question is, more than anything else, is can college football take enough of a bite out of the pie for the NFL to really look in that direction? It's not necessarily about, can you gobble up the NFL? Because you're not going to. Let's just be totally honest. You will lose that battle if you're trying to just outright beat them in terms of the number of people watching your sport. That's never going to happen. But what can happen is, say, there's an arbitrary number, so bear with me a little bit here, but they have, 18 million people watching that game on week 16 of the NFL. If you bring it down to 15 or 14, they're going to start listening. I can almost promise you that. There is going to be a number where if you can take off, 25% or maybe 30% of their viewers, the NFL is going to start looking in that direction. And they're going to start thinking, maybe we should work with this entity to try to figure out what's the best way for both of us to get as many big time slots as possible. And it'll be a really interesting thing to watch because the NFL is not necessarily one to back down from really anyone, and they shouldn't necessarily be because they dominate the conversation. Oh, I'm having a lot of trouble today. I apologize. But the NFL dominates conversation. They dominate TV rights. They dominate pretty much everything in U.S. sports, and I think we all understand that. But you can kind of chip away at them. That's kind of the only hope here. You kind of have to just slowly chip away at what the NFL has, and hopefully it comes together and you're able to kind of make all this happen, because at the end of the day, all of these games should be played on Saturday. I've said this, time and again, that the national championship not being on Saturday is one of probably the craziest thing in our sport. Among a million crazy things in our sport, that is number one that just does not make sense to me. But there's a ton of different things that can kind of be implicated here, where you have Saturdays open towards the back end of the season where maybe you put some bowl games on those days and they get better spotlight later on in December. You have more of ability to put some of the games that you haven't put on Saturday in the future. Obviously, they love those New Year's Eve, New Year's Day games, although I'm not a big New Year's Eve game type guy. I do think there's an ability where if you can push the NFL just a little bit off Saturday, you don't necessarily have to win the fight. You don't necessarily have to totally push them out of your way, but at least kind of nudge them that direction. I think you have an ability to probably open a door where the playoff runs in a more, connected way is the best way to put it, where you have kind of a normal way of going about business, and it's week over week. You don't necessarily have these weird 13-day or 14-day breaks in between. You don't have one team getting a ton of break while another team is, playing game after game. There's a ton of different scheduling things that can happen because of this, but the reality is you have to deal with 2024 first, and you have to make sure that you're not dwarfed by the NFL Week 16, because if you are, then there's going to be a little bit of a conversation around the college football playoff and maybe moving it off those days, which is not at all what we want. The fact that we would even, think about that is crazy, but that's kind of the reality in a lot of these sports. I mean, we talked about the MLB moving the World Series date so they could have a little bit more of a have bigger viewership because they weren't battling the NFL. So that's the power that the NFL holds. I just hope they don't hold it over the college football playoff, because I think when we all look at the playoff coming up, we're all very excited. It's going to be a really, really fun month of football, but I don't want it to overlap with the NFL. I don't want it to, get in the way, not get in the way. It should get in the way of the NFL. The NFL shouldn't get in the way of the college football playoff. But the reality is, there's going to have to be somewhat of a battle. There's going to have to be somewhat of a agreement that has come to. There's not necessarily too much overlap after those first round games, but it doesn't change that it's going to alter the way that people view these games. And if it alters it enough, college football could be looking at another day for those first round games, and that's not at all what any of us want, I can almost imagine. So that's kind of the biggest worry for me. You look at this year and you worry that what happens if those college football first round games don't necessarily go off quite as well as you once hoped? What if they get dwarfed a little bit in the viewership and you decide, well, maybe we'll just move them to Thursday and Friday to accommodate the NFL? They should not do that. College football is a Saturday sport, and if you're going to play all of the games, all of the most important games on weekdays, then Saturday loses all of its meaning in the sport. So I think it would just be ridiculous to move off that day, but the reality is, when you're fighting someone like the NFL, you might have to make some concessions you're not happy to make. And that's a battle that kind of us are going to have to fight. The college football fans are going to have to make sure that we're tuned into those college football playoff games and maybe turn off the NFL game for a second and make sure that the viewership is not too bad. But the reality is, we have to protect Saturdays. Saturdays are the lifeblood of the sport, and it's where all of the big games of the sport should be played. The national championship is one we can deal with down the road, but as of right now, if we need to fend off the NFL to keep that first Saturday in the college football playoff intact, I'm more than happy to do that. So it'll be a fun battle to kind of watch over this next year and really over the next couple of years. But let's take our second break here. When we come back, we're going to talk about recruiting. Tons of stuff going on in recruiting. In fact, Georgia is starting to heat up the way that a lot of people do not want to see Georgia heat up. So we'll talk about that right after this, so stick with us.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about all the implications of the first round playoff game overlapping with one of the NFL weeks and how that's going to kind of affect the way things are scheduled going forward. It'll be very, very interesting to watch that unfold, but let's get into recruiting. There is so much going on in the world of recruiting. As we all know, June and July have become the 2 months that we all have to watch when we talk about recruiting, and things are getting a little bit crazy. Last time we met, we were talking about USC and how they lost two huge recruits, Isaiah Gibson and Justice Terry. Well, one of them found a new home, and it's exactly where we all thought it was going to be. Isaiah Gibson has committed to UGA. He's the number one edge rusher in the country. Obviously a huge get for UGA. They continue to build out one of the best D-line rooms in the entire country, and they're just doing what they're doing. They're going to make a run for the number one class in the country. I tend to believe that's probably where they'll end up at the end of the day, so they're just doing incredible things. In fact, they also added Dontrell Glover, an interior offensive lineman, to this class, 4-star, a very talented kid, 6'3", 315, so he's going to be a force in the run game. There's no two ways about that. They didn't necessarily win everything over the last couple of days. CJ Wiley was a 4-star, very talented wide receiver that they were after. He went to Florida State, which was a huge surprise to pretty much everyone that was following this one. I thought it was going to be either Georgia or LSU, and in fact, I was leaning Georgia, so definitely will be one to watch down the stretch if he does flip from FSU to Georgia, but as of right now, he is a Seminole, and that was a very, very interesting thing that happened yesterday. But the other team I want to kind of zero in on here for a second is Oklahoma. They did a ton of really, really good work on the trail recently. They're picking up dudes in the 25 and 26 class recently. So I want to talk about the guy on the screen first, though, Emmanuel Choice. He's a very, very talented kid out of Lancaster High School, number 9 wide receiver in Texas, just an absolute speedster. When you add him next to Marcus Harris, this is becoming a very, very good wide receiver class for the Sooners. It's just remarkable what they've been able to do, even over the last couple of weeks at that position. And then you had C.J. Nixon, who is a 5-star athlete. They added him to the class, kind of a Nick Harbor type guy. It's someone I absolutely love on South Carolina. He plays edge rusher and wide receiver in high school. Definitely seems to lean more towards the edge rushing role, but he can play both at a really high level. So it could be that this is another type of guy that you see play both ways in the at the college football level. But they're building a number 9 recruiting class over there in Norman right now. So Brent Venables is doing exactly what you need him to do if you're an Oklahoma fan. They also added to the 2026 class, got the number 6 quarterback in the class, Jaden O'Neal, and the number 10 tight end in the class, Ryder Mix. So Oklahoma's just doing all the right things on the recruiting trail right now. But let's move over to Michigan, and let's talk about Donovan Johnson, a very, very talented 4-star running back. This is a huge piece for them. Obviously, the running game is going to be a huge topic of conversation as we get into this season for Michigan and throughout pretty much every season for Michigan going forward. And the reality is Khalil Mullings and Donovan Edwards are likely out the door after this year. So you're going to need new people coming in. Donovan Johnson might just be that guy. And then you have Jacob Washington, a 4-star wide receiver, another huge piece. So it feels like Sharon Moore is pushing just a little bit further into the recruiting game now, obviously losing all the guys they lost last year and some of the guys that they'll lose this year. You're going to have to do that more and more. So he's definitely doing a lot of work out there. They also added Chase Taylor, a 3-star linebacker, and Caden Strahan, a 3-star O-lineman. So really good additions across the board. They're doing some work over the last couple of days, and a lot of people are. But let's get to some teams that are not necessarily on the right side of things, at least right now. And for me, it absolutely starts with Ole Miss. The Ole Miss Rebels lost two big-time commitments with Dylan Alford, a 4-star wide receiver, and an edge rusher, Corey Amos, who is a very talented player. Both decommitted from Ole Miss, I believe yesterday or the day before, I can't exactly remember, but all very, very talented people. Both definitely people that they wanted in this class, I can almost promise you that. So it definitely will be a huge blow to them, and we'll have to be watching Ole Miss fairly closely over the next little bit to figure out what's going on over there. Is things starting to kind of go wrong, or is it not? It'll be really interesting to kind of see how that goes. Then we'll get into Jabari Antoine, a very, very talented 4-star cornerback that is decommitted from LSU. This is one that was really interesting because he was almost immediately crystal ball back to LSU after he decommitted. So I have no earthly idea which way this recruitment is going to go. It's definitely going to be very interesting, but it's not all bad for LSU. They added the number 9 edge rusher in the country, LeJesse Harold, a very, very talented player, huge piece on the defensive side of the ball for LSU because they need as many as they can get right now. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with Antoine, but at least LSU is starting to pick up some of those defensive players that they just haven't in the past necessarily. But the final team that is under some precarious waters right now is USC. Julian Lewis is one of the most talented quarterbacks in the country. We saw him last week at the Elite 11 finals, and he was up in Boulder this weekend, and they made quite the impression. He posted a picture with Shadur talking about possibly passing the torch to him. So it'll be very interesting to see if that kind of develops into anything. Also, Auburn is very much in on this mix. So the reality is USC might be running third, and in fact, I feel like I saw either Chad Simmons or someone in the recruiting world tweet that he thinks USC is running third in this recruitment right now, although having the commitment from him. So that's kind of the world of recruiting that we live in. I tend to lean Auburn if I was going to pick a team that he would flip to, but Colorado made quite the impression this weekend. He would almost definitely start right away. I can promise you that. Also for Auburn, Alvin Henderson has flipped to Auburn from Penn State. We talked about that a little bit last time we talked about recruiting, but it officially happened. So definitely will be an interesting thing to watch there. But Alabama continues to do work on the recruiting trail. Everyone that said Kalen DeBoer cannot recruit, that's a rough scene for you guys. I'll be totally honest with you. This guy is just doing absolute work, and it's a lot in large part because of the staff that he hired. The staff that he got around him is just really remarkable, accounts for some of the deficiencies that he has in the recruiting world. So it'll be really interesting to watch that develop. But they added 4-star O-lineman Micah DeBuse, a very, very talented player. They've just been adding, I think they've added 7 guys since Keelan Russell flipped from SMU to Bama, so it's going to keep happening. They're going to pick up some more guys, and they're going to have one of the top 5 classes in the entire country. I believe they're sitting at number 3 or number 2 right now, but it's going to keep climbing, or, it's going to be right around that top tier towards the end of this, no doubt about that. One team that made absolute history was Memphis. They added Antoine Hill Jr., a 4-star quarterback and the 3rd-ranked guy in the country, according to ESPN, although he is 15th according to On3. So take that with what you will. Decide who you want to trust. But regardless of where you look, he is the highest-rated commit in Memphis football history. So that's an obviously massive get for this program. This will be the starting quarterback likely after Hannigan moves on to the next level, but this guy's really, really talented and obviously an absolutely huge get for them. Another team kind of making history is Wisconsin. They've been doing a really good work on the recruiting trail. They had their best class in history back in 2024. Well, it's getting better in 2025. They're doing absolutely incredible work. They've added 10 recruits in the month of June, and they're up to the number 14 class in the country. So Wisconsin's doing great work. I tend to believe that number will start to drop from 14 down to maybe the 20s-ish, but still that's a fantastic class for Wisconsin and would put them in really good position to continue to build under Luke Fickell up there. Another team I want to talk about is Georgia Tech under Brent Key, because they're doing something that probably should have been done for quite some time at Georgia Tech, at least under the last regime at Georgia Tech, which is they're just narrowing in on Atlanta and trying to dominate there as much as possible. There are so many talented kids in Atlanta. I mean, I grew up here, and some of them played my high school and just did mean things to us. I'll just be totally honest. So they've just been doing incredible things this month in the city of Atlanta, but also just in the world of recruiting in general. They had 3 commits walking into this month. They now have 19, and they're sitting at the number 16 class in the country. So it's ridiculous what they've been able to do over the last little bit, and Brent Key has a very clear vision. That number is likely going to drop from 16 to mid-20s maybe by the time all of this is done. I mean, as of right now, they're only 1 behind Texas, but I tend to believe that's going to widen just a little bit throughout the next little bit. But the reality is Brent Key is doing absolute work, and he's doing things that should have been done at Tech for quite some time, but he's doing them really, really well right now. So it'll be interesting to watch them over the next little bit. Colorado picked up a huge O-line commit with interior offensive lineman Chauncey Gooden, a very talented interior offensive lineman. This guy absolutely is something that Colorado needs, and something I've noticed kind of in the portal / high school recruiting of Dion is O-line seems to be the one high school position that he's prioritizing the most, and I think that's likely the right way to go about business because it's so hard to fit 5 guys together as one unit on the offensive line, and it'll be interesting to see, him added to Jordan Seaton, added to maybe some other guys they've added in the last couple of classes. Maybe in a couple of years they have a full, only high school recruiting class offensive line coming forward there in Colorado, which would be a very interesting thing and kind of a change of pace. But it seems like that's one of the positions where he's saying, we love the portal kids and we'll use them to patch the holes, but the base of this offensive line needs to be built through high school. So that's definitely a very interesting thing to watch, kind of develop over the next little bit. But another interior offensive lineman that came off the board was John Mills, and he committed to the team that is on his sweatshirt right there. He committed to Texas. He is a huge kid, 6'6", 330. This kid is exactly how Texas has been recruiting the offensive line. They've just been getting absolutely huge kids and just developing them as well as they possibly can. And with a guy like Kyle Flood on your staff, you're going to do a pretty good job developing offensive linemen. So it feels like Sark and company are trying to develop that Bama type team where the offensive line is going to hold up for 2, 3, 4, 10 seconds. They're going to do incredible things and give that quarterback plenty of time. And if they can do that, no matter who's back there at quarterback, they're going to be able to execute that offense for Steve Sarkisian just at a ridiculous clip, the same way that Mac Jones did in 2020. So it'll be interesting to watch that develop and if John Mills is a part of that offensive line once that team comes around, hypothetically. And then Ohio State, I want to finish it out on. They continue to rack in talent. Zion Grady is a very talented edge rusher, number 11 edge rusher in the country. This guy is just incredible. Ohio State now has 2 of the top 11 edge rushers in the country, so they're doing absolute work at that position to replace JTT and Jack Sawyer when they officially walk out the door to the NFL. So the pass rush will not be suffering at Ohio State for quite some time. No worries there, but the reality is this is only a little bit of bite of the pie. There is going to be a million other things that happen throughout the end of the month and then into July. It's going to be absolutely insane. There's no two ways about that, but we'll keep you updated with everything as it comes. I tend to believe that the teams you need to watch over the next little bit are Georgia and Texas. I think they're going to heat up and get some huge commits over the next little bit. Georgia just got one with Isaiah Gibson, but they're definitely going to keep coming. Then you have Alabama to watch. You have Ohio State that's going to keep racking in guys. LSU feels like they're starting to kind of pick up steam. So it's going to be really interesting to watch this kind of unfold and see who ends up coming out on top. I tend to lean Georgia, but there's plenty of teams kind of pushing for that crown. So it'll be interesting to see how that develops. But we'll take our third break here. And when we come back, we're going to talk about the Heisman Watch segment that we've been doing throughout the last couple of days. We've done the SEC. We've done the Big Ten. Now it's time for the Big 12. And we'll break down some of the guys that I'm watching most closely. But stick with us, and we'll be right back with that.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the recruiting updates. It's been an absolutely crazy couple of weeks, so I wanted to make sure you guys had all the information over the last little bit, but let's get into Heisman Watch. We've been doing this the last couple of days. We got into the SEC the first time around, the Big Ten yesterday. Now it's time for the Big 12, which is my favorite conference going into this year, so absolutely love talking about this conference whenever I get the chance, but let's start with, excuse me, I apologize. Let's start with someone that is a little bit of a dark horse in this camp. Obviously, as we've talked about in the last couple of days, we're going to do one dark horse, and then throughout the 5, I'd like to have at least 3 positions represented, so it's not just a quarterback fest throughout the entire thing, because that's no fun for anyone. But let's start with my dark horse that I'm watching most closely, and it's got to be Jalen Daniels. I think when I look at this kid, there are so many things that he can do. And frankly, there's not a lot of quarterbacks in this conference that he takes a backseat to when it comes to talent. He can do so many things on the football field and can really do just incredible things. So I think when we talk about this kid, the big denominator is he healthy? If he's on the field, Kansas plays some really good football and they tend to win a lot of games. When he's not on the field or when he's struggling on the field, it's not necessarily as pretty. So the injury trouble is obviously something that we're going to have to watch, but the reality is he can make a ton of throws. He can make pretty much every play you want him to make with his legs. He can do a ton of really good things, and more than anything else, he is as much of a gamer as it gets. The kid is going to make sure that you win games, and he's going to have to, if he has to get, dirty and sweaty and a little bit bloody to do that, he's going to do it. He's just a remarkable player and one of my favorite players in the entire country, frankly. So I'd absolutely love to see him in New York City. I think he is someone that, right now we're definitely not talking about him getting there, but the reality is if Kansas puts up a 10-2, 11-1 season and Jalen Daniels is at the very center of it, he's at least going to be in the conversation. I can't promise that he's going to make it to New York City, but I can say pretty confidently that Jalen Daniels would be a huge reason if Kansas is able to make the run that they're hoping to make this upcoming year. But let's get into the top 5, and this is obviously a little bit different than what I would normally do with the restrictions on the number of positions I have to include, but I do want to start with Travis Hunter at number 5, and the only reason he's at number 5, frankly, is because of the team he's on and the kind of circumstances around him, because, frankly, this might be the best football player in the conference. There are a couple of issues why I don't think he might win the Heisman, but this might be the best pure football player we've seen, maybe in the country around some people, but at least in this conference, I feel pretty confident saying this is the best football player. Now, Colorado, the issue is they're not going to be that great of a team, at least from my eyes. I see them as a 6, 7, 8 win team, somewhere in that kind of area. And as we talked about yesterday, the only person that has won a Heisman with any team under 9 wins is Ricky Williams in 1998. So it's been quite some time, and it could be that it's a totally new moniker that you have to reach. You have to reach 9 wins to get a Heisman. Who knows? But the reality is he's definitely someone that could pull that off. But let's say hypothetically they get to 9 wins or they get to 10 wins and they do incredible things. It's going to be his quarterback that gets the Heisman love. It's going to be Shedeur Sanders that gets all the Heisman love and not so much Travis Hunter. So as much as I would love to put him higher on this list and as much as I think he frankly is the best football player in this conference, bar none, it does create kind of an issue where you're not only battling, your team being as good as they need to be for you to get into this award, but also if your team is that good, it's likely going to be the quarterback that gets that praise and gets that ticket to New York City. So it'll be really interesting to watch. Obviously, Travis Hunter is absolutely remarkable, and he was last year, but the reality is I think his role on the offensive side is going to step back just a little bit, and frankly, I think that's a good thing. I think they have more wide receivers to choose from this upcoming year to kind of play around with, but also that being said, most people at the NFL level see him as a wide receiver, so it'll be kind of an interesting battle. We'll see what his splits are on either side of the ball. I mean, frankly, he played pretty much the entire game a year ago, pretty much every week, so we'll see what happens, but I just don't think the Heisman is necessarily too much in reach for Travis Hunter for a number of different reasons. But let's get into number 4, and I have Cam Rising here, and this was a conversation that I was a little bit conflicted about. I was battling between him and Noah Fafita, and I made a decision that I think is the right one, and I kind of went with the guy that I know is going to give me good football, and I know that its team is going to win a lot of games. I have some worries about Arizona outside of those 2 big-time players that they have. Also, they have Takario Davis. They have some good players over there at Arizona. There's no two ways about that. But when I look at what Cam Rising is and what he has been in the past, when he's on the field, he's going to give you good football. There's no two ways about that. He's always going to put up at least solid stats. It's not necessarily going to be the prettiest thing in the world at all times, and he's not necessarily going to put up gaudy numbers, but he's going to give you really good football. And if this team runs the table and wins the Big 12 relatively convincingly, there's an argument to be made that he absolutely should be in that conversation. So I do think it's going to be one of those kind of battles back and forth between, this might not be the most talented quarterback in the conference, but I do think he has the cleanest path to going undefeated, to playing really good football the entire way, and to winning this conference. So it'll be kind of interesting to see how that develops. But also, I think the wide receiver talent is much stronger this year than it was in past years he's been at Utah. And I think the big thing here is Dorian Singer adding to that wide receiver group is just insane. I think he's going to definitely be the top receiver for them. I think him and Cam Rising seem to already have a great connection, so it'll be fascinating to watch that develop. But if Cam Rising somehow pulls this off, he will have one of the craziest careers we've seen in college football in quite some time. He will have started his career at Texas, transferred to Utah, won 2 Pac-12 titles, got injured for a full year, came back, won the Big 12, and a Heisman. So it would have been a wild, wild ride for Cam Rising. But the reality is I think he's going to play some really good football and might just be able to find himself into these conversations. But number 3, I have Ollie Gordon. I think when you look at Ollie Gordon, I've been trying to rack my brain for a player around the country that has a better situation for them in particular. And I don't think I can find one. There are plenty of really, really good situations around there. You know, I think Will Howard's in a great situation with Chip Kelly over there at Ohio State. I think Dylan Gabriel's in a great situation with Will Stein at Oregon. But when you talk about Ollie Gordon, it's almost perfect. He, first of all, is remarkable. He was just incredible a year ago, won the Doak Walker Award. But the reality is he's also behind one of the most experienced, one of the best offensive lines in the entire country. So he's going to be able to have plenty of running room and plenty of area to not necessarily get hit right at the line of scrimmage every single time. So he's going to be just a remarkable player to watch. And frankly, not having to face some of these big-time defensive lines that he had to face in the past, like Oklahoma and Texas, are definitely going to help. Now, Utah is going to fill that void just fine, don't get me wrong, but I do think there's going to be an ability for him to just dominate games and get, 30 carries in some games and just have just ridiculous amounts of yards. So I think when you talk about this offense, Alan Bowman, I do expect to take a step forward. I do expect him to be a bigger part of the offense, but the reality is it starts with Ollie Gordon, and it pretty much finishes with Ollie Gordon. So it'll be really interesting to watch kind of how that develops. But as of right now, I think he's the guy that I'm pointing to as a possible Heisman contender. He does need to get a little bit better in the receiving game if he does want to pull that off, in my opinion. But the running numbers are just going to be insane. There's no two ways about that. But let's move to the top 2, and Shedeur Sanders is at my number 2 spot. We talked about it with Travis Hunter. I don't think this is going to be that great of a team. We talked about the Ricky Williams example. This is the same type of thing with Shedeur Sanders. But if anyone can pull off a team winning 8 games and still making a Heisman ceremony trip, it would be Shedeur Sanders. Not only because of who he is and his name, which obviously holds some weight. There's no two ways about that. But also, this kid is really talented. I think that is abundantly clear from last year. There is no doubt about it. He can make pretty much every single throw on the field, can extend plays with his legs, can digest defenses relatively well. So he does tons of really, really good things. And I think if they can get to 9 or 10 wins, it's going to be in large part because of how good he was. And he's going to be in those conversations. There's almost no doubt in my mind. So I think he has an ability to do that if the offensive line holds up for him, maybe cuts the sacks in half. In fact, that's something that Dion and Joel Klatt talked about in the conversation that we talked about yesterday. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens here. I tend to believe that this team just won't be quite good enough for him to crack that list, but who knows? He's a very special quarterback, and the team around him is better this year. But let's get to my number 1 pick, and I think Avery Johnson has an opening this year that a lot of people might just not fully realize. I think everyone understands that Kansas State's going to be a fantastic team. I don't think they understand how much this guy is going to play a part in that. I think he's going to be one of the most special players in the entire country and definitely in this conference. So when I look at this conference, I'm trying to think, or especially when I talk about Heisman players, you try to think of really special dynamic players that are on teams that can make runs. This is that guy. He can make plays with his legs, has a much better arm than people give him credit for, knocked out a guy that is now playing at Ohio State. He's starting for Ohio State, and he essentially kicked that guy out of the building because he was so good. That's the type of player that we're dealing with, and I think he's one of those guys that absolutely can make some noise. He can do literally anything you want him to do on the football field. The schedule is very digestible for Kansas State, and if he makes a run into the Big 12 championship, maybe into the playoff, there's going to be some people looking in that direction because not only are the passing numbers going to be insane, but the rushing numbers are just going to be insane as well. So I could see a game where he has 500 yards, 4 touchdowns, leads them to a huge victory, and everyone kind of shoots their head in that direction and realizes that Avery Johnson is absolutely the real deal. So cannot wait for that kid. I think when I talk about the Heisman in the Big 12, for me, it all starts with that kid. But it's going to be fascinating to watch all of these players develop. Obviously, we'll get into the ACC tomorrow, But for now, we'll take our final break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about Wednesday what ifs. Tons to break down with a ton of very interesting questions going into this year, so stick with us, and we'll be right back with that. All right, excuse me. Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about a little bit of the Heisman watch. We got into the Big 12, broke down a dark horse and the top 5 players that I'm watching most closely for the Heisman in that conference. But now let's get into some Wednesday what-ifs. There's so much happening across the country and so many things going into this season that are pretty much unknown. So let's get into some of the questions that I have. If this happens, what happens because of it? And the biggest one I have is, what happens if Notre Dame goes undefeated? As we all know, Notre Dame is a team that has a running joke that they never really play anybody. And the vast majority of the time that is not true. This year it might be, to be totally honest with you. They do still have some big-time games. They do have A&M, Florida State, Louisville, USC. But when you look at this schedule, comparative to some other ones around the country especially, and even former Notre Dame ones, it's relatively easy. Let's just be totally honest. I've been on record saying anything 11-1 or maybe 10-2, depending on where those losses come, should keep them out of the playoff. I'll just be totally honest. Anything 9-3 or below definitely should not make them in. But it'll be really interesting to watch this develop. But the reality is, I think there's going to be a very interesting conversation had if they do go undefeated. First of all, everyone's going to say that they didn't play anyone. I fully understand that argument. It won't necessarily be the case because going undefeated against pretty much any schedule is really, really tough regardless. But the reality is there's going to be some things happening in South Bend that are going to be pretty special. And it all starts, frankly, with Marcus Freeman. This guy is a very, very special person coming up on this year. I think when we look at what happened a couple of years ago with Brian Kelly leaving for the LSU job and everything kind of happening around that, it felt like Notre Dame fans were not angry, not necessarily totally fine with the situation, but it felt like they weren't quite as angry as some other fan bases might be if a coach like Brian Kelly decided to leave for LSU. They knew who they had. Marcus Freeman is one of those guys that was just waiting in the wings, ready to go, ready to lead a big-time program, and it's been an interesting first couple of years, not necessarily the most linear path forward for him, but the reality is I think he's building something that is going to be really solid this upcoming year. The defensive side of the ball is just insane, and when you have a defensive-minded coach like Marcus Freeman, you're going to be able to do that for quite some time. So I have no real worries there. Riley Leonard coming in at quarterback is a huge addition. Chris Mitchell at wide receiver. They've done a lot of really good things to set themselves up for this year. And I think if they go undefeated, I think there has to be a conversation of what does the future look like under Notre Dame? Because they obviously, they're not going to be in a conference. At least they haven't necessarily shown any interest in being in a conference going forward. So they're going to still be sitting out there and kind of doing their own thing and just kind of, frankly, rolling into the playoff every single year. I apologize. I'm all over the place today. But he's one of those guys that I think could make a huge jump where I would probably not have him in the top 10 head coaches in the country right now, but he could easily make the jump into the top 5 depending on what he does this upcoming year, because I have a ton of respect of what he's doing up there at Notre Dame. It's been a little bit of a tough path the first couple of years, but this is a year where a lot of things are on the table for them, going to the playoff, possibly winning one of those playoff games and getting further down the road. So it'll be fascinating to watch. Obviously, they aren't eligible for one of those byes because they're not in a conference, but they still could be that number 5 team or that number 6 team and get a really good draw the first round and then possibly get that ACC or Big 12 champion. So Notre Dame has a very comfortable path, I suppose, to find their way into maybe the semifinals of the playoff, where if you go undefeated, if you go 11-1 in this year, there's going to be some conversations to be had around Notre Dame and around Marcus Freeman as we go into this next era of college football. And I think Notre Dame has a very good situation, frankly, because not that they're guaranteed a spot in the playoff every single year, but not playing in a conference, you have a little bit more of an ability to put together a schedule that is a little bit more favorable, let's just put it that way. So it'll be really interesting to watch this develop. It'll definitely be something that I'm watching very closely, but Marcus Freeman could become one of the biggest names in the sport this year. He could become someone that everyone is after whenever they have an opening, and frankly, I don't think he's going anywhere. I think he's very, very happy at Notre Dame and wants to build a winner there, but the reality is if he goes undefeated this year, makes the playoff, maybe even makes a run in the playoff, he's going to be talked about as one of the best coaches in the country, and he probably should be. And Notre Dame is going to be looked at as a team that not only is going to be able to get into the playoff in the next little bit, but maybe just do something that they haven't done in the past and win a national title. So it'll be really, really interesting to watch that develop. Obviously, Marcus Freeman has a ton riding on this year, but it'll be fascinating to watch this team develop because I think they're a really, really good team. They just need a couple of things to follow their direction. But let's get into the second what if, and what if Bama drops that game to Wisconsin? I understand that that's a game that everyone's kind of pointing at and kind of, laughing it off. Bama rolls in, beats Wisconsin, rolls out. That's the end of the day. And I kind of understand that approach, don't get me wrong. But the reality is when we look at Bama over the last couple of years, there's been something that's been happening. And it's frankly very, very obvious to anyone that's been watching them over the last couple of years. When they leave Bryant-Denny Stadium, things get really interesting. And it almost doesn't matter where they're going. I mean, last year they went down to South Florida, and it was the ugliest game of football I've ever seen a Nick Saban team play. Truly, I've never seen anything quite like that. And a lot of it had to do with the quarterback situation they had going on. But this is something that's continuously happened. They've fought Auburn every single time that they've gone down there the last couple of times. LSU is always going to be a fight. That's kind of a side conversation more than anything else. They struggled against Texas, which was a team that was really good at the time, but Bama was a better team than Texas was in that game. Let's just be totally honest. They probably should have won by 10 to 14 points, but it was a very close game because of that atmosphere and because Bama just doesn't really handle the road very well, or at least they haven't in the last couple of years. So it'll be really interesting to watch that kind of develop, but the reality is they're not necessarily walking into, a library. They're walking into one of those stadiums that can get rocking, and I promise you they will be on that Saturday because they want this one as bad as they've wanted really any win in the past little bit. Obviously, you want that Ohio State win every year. You want that Michigan win. You want that Penn State win. But the reality is, if they beat Bama, if Luke Fickell can find a way to beat Bama in the second week of his second year at Wisconsin, the conversation is going to get really interesting really quickly, not only around Wisconsin, but around Bama, obviously. People are going to be wondering, is Kalen DeBoer the wrong guy? Even though I wouldn't necessarily put that on him because of this loss, I do think there are going to be people that are asking that question. And then it also opens the door for an 8-4 or a 7-5 season for Bama, which is crazy to think about for Bama fans and definitely would really start disaster mode down there in Tuscaloosa. So it's one of those games where you look at it at face value, it's not necessarily that scary, right? It's Alabama against Wisconsin. It should be an Alabama win. And that tends to be where I'm leaning right now. But the reality is, this is a dangerous team. I think Wisconsin has an ability that some people just aren't really keen on yet or aren't necessarily come around on yet. I think one of the big reasons is Tyler Van Dyke. He didn't necessarily play great football a year ago at Miami, but I do think there is an opening at Wisconsin where he's not going to be asked to do as much in the pass game, and also the secondary he might be going up against in this Bama game might not be as strong as it might be later in the season and down the road, because some freshmen are just going to have to play right away. Probably Zabian Brown at one of the cornerback positions, maybe Jalen Mbakwe at one of them. But the reality is he's going to be able to attack some of the younger guys on this team. And if he has success doing that, things get really interesting around this game. So it'll be fascinating to watch that unfold. Obviously, this is not something that Bama wants. If this does happen to Bama, it's going to be really uncomfortable in Tuscaloosa. And obviously, all of this could change throughout the season. He could still have a fantastic season down there, even losing to Wisconsin. But I don't know. This one would definitely open a lot of people's eyes, and a lot of people would be looking at Kalen DeBoer with a little bit of a side eye after this game if this were to happen. But let's get into the last what if, and frankly, it's the craziest one on on this list, and it's what if Florida State, Miami, and Clemson all miss the ACC championship game? I made a prediction on here that I think Florida State and Clemson will miss it, but that's something that we'll see once I get into my predictions a little bit down the road here. But what if Miami misses it as well? First of all, the ACC would still have a really good title game because there's so many great teams in the ACC this year that will have just really, really fun products to watch on the field, whether you're talking about NC State, Virginia Tech, Louisville, SMU. It'll be a really fun game regardless, so don't worry about that. But we'll have tons of questions around those teams. Clemson will question, is the way that Dabo going about business, is that the right way? Is he making a mistake by doing the things that he's doing? And do they kind of push him to kind of take a step back and rethink the transfer portal way of going about business? So that'll be a really interesting conversation. Florida State will be, frankly, torn to pieces. I'll be totally honest with you. When you talk about what happened last year and the, hubbub that was made, I suppose, around their playoff selection and how they kind of got snubbed, if they come out of the gate and have a really rough season next year and don't make the ACC title, there will be people that will say they were a flash in the pan. There will be people that will say that everything just lined up perfectly for you guys and that was the end of the story and Florida State isn't actually a for-real team. I don't think that'll be the case, but I do think that will be a conversation that happens, and there will be a little bit of a worry around Florida State, that's for sure, because you really want to build off what you had last year, and if you don't, then you could be heading into a new conference with some problems. You could be staying in the ACC, just not at the place that you thought you would be. So it'll be really interesting to watch that. And then you have Miami, obviously, where you might just be questioning where Mario Cristobal's time goes from here. Who is the head coach 2 or 3 years down the road if Miami falls on their face this year, because they pushed the chips to the center of the table. I think we all understand that. Getting in Cam Ward, getting in all of the transfers that they brought, they have to compete for at least an ACC title. They have to maybe even at least get there because this talent on this team is just ridiculous. So there will definitely be a conversation where people around Coral Gables are saying, is Mario Cristobal the guy? Is he the right guy for this job? And if he misses the title game, the seat will definitely warm just a little bit. I don't think he'll necessarily be fired by any means, but they'll definitely start having some interesting conversations, I'll say, down in Coral Gables. But overall, it'll be really interesting to watch this develop. I think the ACC is going to be really tough, and they're going to have teams like North Carolina State, like Virginia Tech, that could trip them up along the way and could be in Charlotte at the end of the year. And frankly, it would still be a fantastic game, so I wouldn't necessarily be too upset about that. But also, on top of this, the ACC looking at Clemson and Florida State walking out the door wouldn't quite hurt as much necessarily if they didn't play in the championship game. So that's a little cherry on top for all the ACC fans out there. But the reality is it would be a wild thing if this were to happen, but it definitely could. The ACC is a wild place this upcoming year, so it'll be interesting to see that develop. But that'll do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Thank you so much for tuning in. Your support means the world to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does make a huge difference. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all of the social pages for all of the content and updates you could possibly need. We have so many people doing just incredible work across every single sport you could possibly want. So definitely check it out. If you need anything in the world of sports, we totally have you covered. But thank you once again for listening, and I will see you guys tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.